I'll be speaking about cultural appropriation. Before I get started, I use she, they pronouns, and I want to begin by saying that I'm speaking to you all from the Twin Cities on occupied Dakota land. I'm not talking about the work that I do with Native women on the front lines for missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives or climate change, but I'm happy to talk about that if it comes up in the discussion. I think there are some things related to cultural appropriation around that. But let's kind of give you a heads up of where we're headed tonight. So introductions, I want to tell you a little bit more about myself to situate the work that I'll be talking to you about. We'll then talk about what culture is, what cultural appropriation is. We'll look at two examples. So I'll tell you two different kind of stories. And then we'll look at what's at stake and how cultural affirmation, the different practices that we can take, and then finally have some discussion. So as we're going, if there's any questions, feel free to drop them in the chat. If I miss them, we can come back to them later. And I'll have my chat open and try to do both as we are moving through. So a little bit more about myself here. I come first as a researcher, and for me, part of my artistic career is part of my research. So I don't see my artistic production separate as my research. I see them together. But one of the things I'm working on is a book project. It's called Midwest Movidas, Latina Cultural Organizing in the Twin Cities. These beautiful faces are mujeres that I have been working with for almost a decade at this point. Started this work in graduate school when I was at UC Santa Barbara and Chicana and Chicano Studies there. These folks, maybe you recognize them. They're pretty much all from the Twin Cities, but they're poets. They are printmakers, sculptors, muralists, hip hop MCs, singers, performance artists. They definitely are interdisciplinary. For example, some of them, like Magdalena here, started off as a poet, and now she's painting murals. So it's really wonderful to see how their work has evolved. Along with the book project, I'm also a performance artist. Here's some stills from the naked stages that I did in 2016. This was a piece about my grandfather. He was a barber from East LA, and he had been a barber in LA for 50 years. When I got this fellowship, I was doing a very different project about him still, but he passed away in the span of this 9-month fellowship. And so this piece really turned into a piece around mourning and healing. And it was also about eminent domain. My grandfather's childhood home in East LA was torn down to make way for the 60 highway. His barber shop, which he owned for 34 years, the government declared eminent domain and turned it into a parking lot. And then the home that he lived in with my nana for 40 years, his adult home, the government declared eminent domain to expand the 605 freeway. So a lot around how do we mourn, how do we heal, where do we find home when our home is constantly being taken from us. Other work I like to do in collaboration with other people, perhaps you know some of these artists, Gianna Petrus, she's a fantastic playwright and young adult fiction writer. Sarita Collette does a lot of work through yoga actually, but we were commissioned to do a performance in response to Ken Gonzalez Day's work. For me, being able to work collaboratively as an artist is really important. And I think that, maybe we'll talk more about this in the discussion, particularly when we're thinking of cultural appropriation. The flip side around affirmation is building deep relationships with people across races and ethnicity and different cultures. And for me, I think it's so fruitful as an artist to be able to create in those kind of spaces. I also have a social practice art project. It's called La Luchadora. It's a mobile screen cart. I've gone all around the state of Minnesota to do different engagement projects. I'm hired by city staff, community organizations, sometimes urban developers, it kind of just runs the gamut here. Libraries, they're my favorite place to go. But it's really about how do we use art as a way to engage with the public. So tonight, we're talking about cultural appropriation. And before we can really dive into cultural appropriation, I think we need to investigate culture. I'm currently teaching a cultural studies class at the U of M, so the timing is perfect. But before I jump into how I'm understanding culture for this conversation, I'd love to see in the chat what you think about when you hear the word culture. What comes to mind? History, definitely. What else? I'll just wait a few minutes. We have honoring ancestors, traditions, heritage, religious practices and traditions, how we dress, art, stories, ethnicity, lifestyles, a group of people sharing the same beliefs, art, language, food, part of who we are. Absolutely, these are excellent. Behavior, most definitely. So here's a really broad kind of generic definition I think we get often when we hear culture. A lot of what customs, a lot of what you've said is here. So culture, beliefs, ideas, traditions, speech, and material objects associated with a particular group of people in a set time and place. So definitely this is impacting our behavior. Heather says how we interact, eye contact, touch, volume of our voice, for sure, all culturally related. So for me, when I'm thinking about culture, I think a lot of times people might say customs, language, dress, but we also never want to forget we're talking about a specific time and a specific place. And we'll dive deeper into that in a second. So there's a lot of cultural studies theorists I chose to share with you tonight, kind of the big three in terms of the work that I do. The first is Raymond Williams. And for Raymond Williams, he talks about there's kind of three ways of understanding culture. The first is culture can be the ideal, the universal human experience. And what we talk about oftentimes in Chicana studies is that, yes, there might be these universal human experiences such as love or anger, sadness, perhaps. But what happens historically, we know through histories of colonization and imperialism, what we see happening in our contemporary day and age is that unfortunately, we don't still live in a present society where we're all seen as having full capacity to be human because of the various systemic oppressions that we experience. And so this ideal, Raymond Williams says, is not often achievable, right? Because of these different histories and powers. The second type of culture Raymond Williams talks about is documentary. So just the most basic way we can understand the material object of culture, the painting, the film, the cookbook. And these really are just how we document or record, but it's not tied to any particular ideal and it's not tied to particular history. And then the third, Raymond Williams says, is we can understand culture as social. And this is really digging into the idea of power relations. So for Raymond Williams, he's talking about culture in the terms of social is how ideas, behaviors circulate, which are some of the things you all had said. And this can be in a small family unit. It doesn't have to be a nuclear traditional family, but any type of family unit, kinship network. It can be in a neighborhood, in a community, but the idea is that there's movement here and then it circulates. The second really important cultural studies theorist we have is Stuart Hall. Stuart Hall, for him, first and foremost, when we think about culture, we have to understand our own positionality. So for example, how we identify based on social identities. And social identities here are the big, large identity markers: gender, class, sexuality, religion, geography, immigration status, language. Positionality in this sense does not account for our personality traits. So for example, are you funny or are you very sensitive? We're really thinking about the social identities here. Positionality for Stuart Hall is important because we understand our relationship to culture based on who we are in a specific time and place. And for Hall, there's like two types of cultural identities. The first is a collective oneness. And this is neither always positive or negative. It can have both attributes at once. So for example, when we look back to the liberation movements of the 60s and 70s, we had a lot of cultural nationalist movements happening, such as the American Indian movement, the Chicano movement, the Black Power movement. And while some of those people within those movements, we could classify them as separatists, cultural nationalist separatists that, you know, have a very different ideology. For the most part, most folks in those movements were really interested in how their collective oneness, their collective culture could bring them together to create a better world. And so for Hall, we can think of cultural identity in that way. But he says that also culture is much more complex than that. That culture, we also have to understand, is always becoming in a set of relations in a given time and space. And for Hall, that means it's constantly changing and constantly adapting. It's not fixed, which is really important, I think, when we're talking about cultural appropriation later, because none of these rules are necessarily set in stone, right? They always have to evolve as we are evolving as society. And then the third way for looking at culture, Arlene Davila talks about invisible and hyper invisible cultures. And she says, in the United States, dominant culture, oftentimes meaning here, European ancestry, so white, male, heterosexual, middle class, upper class, these become the dominant cultural tropes. And so they become invisible. And I see this a lot of times with my students in the classroom. When I ask my white students what their cultural background is, unfortunately, a lot of them cannot name it, because that's one of the tragedies of white supremacy. It strips away this type of unique ethnic identity. And so part of what we'll talk about later is like reclaiming our own cultural roots if we've been disconnected from them. And in addition to invisible, Davila talks about hyper invisibility. And she says, for communities who do not match dominant culture, their way of being becomes hyper visible, hyper noticeable. An example of this is my daughter's Afro-Latina. And so her hair looks very different from a lot of people that she goes to daycare with. And while it's a compliment, because we try to make her hair look cute every morning, every time we take her to school, the teachers comment about her hair and want to touch her hair sometimes. And which is not always appropriate, right? Especially if they don't really know her well as they were getting to know her. But if my daughter had hair like everybody else, we wouldn't really see any difference, right? It would just become part of the norm. And so that's something to think about in terms of this idea of invisible and hyper visible. So my main point when we're talking about culture is that, and I think, you already are aware of this in some of the comments you're writing. When we talk about culture, we're talking about our history, we're talking about our own social position, and we're talking about power. So I want to tell a story before we get into cultural appropriation here. These images, do they look familiar to folks? Where have we seen them before? What era are they from? You want to drop in the chat? Okay, we've seen them. I'll help us out a little bit. We're looking at World War II here, right? That era. Thank you. Yes, Leslie, World War II. These images, we could say perhaps are canonical, right? They are very, they circulate heavily in our culture. And we have on the left, the Rosie the Riveter. When we talk about World War II, what we get are these images that can stand in our mind historically. Perhaps we've seen this, right? We Can Do It, very popular. Here, World War II, you have women who are entering the workforce. We see a shift between domestic and public spaces. And for white middle-class women, particularly who are entering into the workforce for this time, it's really important in terms of the change in gender roles for their household here because of war times. And this, when I see this image, it's very powerful, right? She's very strong. She is confident. It makes me feel happy to see something like this. At the same time, I don't see myself in this, which is fine. We don't see ourselves in all culture necessarily. But part of our memory of culture and what circulates, sometimes it depends on, again, our positionality. So other images from World War II that are perhaps less popular. We have a lot of Black women who are also doing work similar to middle-class white women, but for many working class Black women, this is not the first time they've entered into the workforce. However, it is perhaps maybe the first time they've been let into some of these more male-dominated spaces. On the right-hand side, we have a picture, and I know it's a little grainy. These are Chicanas, Mexican Americans from the Midwest. They call themselves Rositas the Riveters. And here you can see them. There's really great work I'm happy to share later about this in the Midwest. So then we have folks that try to take this iconic cultural symbol that we see, and rather than appropriate it, they remix it, they reform it. Roberto Valadez does this one, Si Se Puede, and this image is of the Adelita. Adelitas were Mexican women who fought during the Mexican-American War right alongside the men. So you see she's got a rifle in her hand ready to go. But again, the very iconic arm means that we're seeing parallels here. Another remix we see is one of Frida. She has the tattoo, it's kind of cut off, but it says Diego on it. Frida being the Mexican artist, muralist, self-portrait. And we have the eagle that's hearkening back to the Mexican flag. And then my favorite, Chale, which is, I guess we would call it Galo, which is a particular type of Chicano Spanish. And here we have an image of a pachuca. And again, if you aren't familiar with these type of cultural references, perhaps this doesn't mean much, but we do have that signifier similar of the arm from the Rosie the Riveter. So what these images play out in real time, if we remember the first images we saw of the men and the woman kissing and the women in the workforce. During World War II, we also have subcultures. So we have more dominant cultures. Here we have a subculture, the Pachucas and the Pachucos. I love the image on the left because we often think of Pachucas and Pachucos, the zoot suit wearers of only women wearing the skirt, but they also wore the dress here. And so this was a subculture. And subcultures within a culture, so this is within probably the Chicano Mexican American culture, we might not even recognize if we're not part of that. There's a scholar, Nick Centino, and he talks about subcultures as scenes, right? Either you're on the scene or you're not on the scene. Perhaps one of the stories we don't learn about in World War II, though, is the Zoot Suit riots of 1943, where in Southern California, you had white servicemen that were stationed in home, and they came and because of racial circumstances, class differences, attacked Mexican-American youth. In the middle, you see images where they were physically pulling off their clothes, because for service folks, these zoot suits, this subculture, was extremely offensive. What do you do in wartime? You make sure that you are not using excess material. And this subculture became very subversive because the zoot suit was nothing but excessive material, right? It was a real way of trying to be confrontational. And so there were violent consequences for this. And you see on the far right, you have women who were arrested that were trying to fight back. I share all of this with you because I really want to drive home the point that something as simple as a fashion material object like the zoot suit has real political consequences. Our culture, our beliefs, our language, our history, they're not just celebrations, which oftentimes is how we want to understand culture, but that they can be tied to violence. They are tied to forms of systemic oppression that can have real negative impacts on us. This is important for us to remember when we're talking about cultural appropriation, because oftentimes what I hear around cultural appropriation is people who are doing the appropriating say things like, well, those people are being so sensitive. Why does it matter? And this is the reason for one of why it matters, because there are violent consequences at times in our history and in our contemporary life for when our culture is taken from us. So moving on, cultural appropriation. What is it? Sort of maybe a little harder to drop in the chat, but if you have, let's do what you could do feelings about cultural appropriation, or words, short phrases that come when you hear cultural appropriation. Yeah, definitely. Taking from another's culture, passing it as your own, trying to be what you're not, taking ideas from another culture, using imagery from someone else, one's own gain, shifting of cultural identity, refabrication of cultural designs, imitating cultural expression with regard for origin, often for profit, flaunting piece of other histories without understanding one's privilege. These are excellent. we'll just stop the talk right there. No, I appreciate all these comments. I'm going to share a next slide here of some images. Yeah, looks like you got it for sure. So I feel like I picked a lot on Katy Perry, but that was not my intention in this. This is no disrespect to her. These are just images that came up when I've been searching and talking about this for years. But yeah, what are some things that we see here in these images? And you can chat or you can unmic, whatever is easiest.
A lot of just not understanding where the clothes and other pieces of heritage come from without understanding the significance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, my culture is not a costume. Definitely, Holly writes that. It's a movement campaign that comes out every year for Halloween. And teaching at the U, I feel like I have to have that conversation every year. Definitely. What else? White people imitating other cultures.
Yep, it's mostly white people.
Mm-hmm.
Just disrespect and ignorance. Oh, you go first.
Nope, go ahead.
And disrespect and ignorance of other people's cultures, not understanding the significance.
Mm-hmm. Stereotyping.
Similar to what I was going to say, and just adding that historical piece of not, like my daughter wanted to put something up at a place and she was told she couldn't, she's biracial, in her reaction to George Floyd, and she couldn't because they said it was too controversial, but yet a white girl who painted a bunch of Black people could sell hers because it was done in a nice way. And so that's one of the things, like that impact of like how it impacts people of color, even not understanding like the historical and other contexts of like, she can't go around wearing her hair a certain way, but other people get to do it and profit off of it.
Mm-hmm.
Right, like there's been kids been banned from school for wearing hair like mine, and there's laws, and the military only recently addressed about hair being in traditionally African American styles, and yet there's absolutely no consequences whatsoever for when a white person decides to wear their hair in cornrows or box braids or other types of traditional hairstyles.
Great, thank you for your comments. I mean, I think also what we're seeing here is some of these things are individual choices, perhaps. The image is over here, more of the costumes, right? It might be a personal choice. But a lot of these, whether we're talking about Taylor Swift, Gwen Stefani, Katy Perry, these aren't just individual choices. These are teams of people. So this means that this image here went through a large team of people, stylists, artistic directors, choreographers. Multiple people played a role in this, and yet multiple people didn't say anything. And so that's something also I think that's important for us to keep in mind when we're having these conversations is we're going to talk a lot about the individual here. What's our individual responsibility? But also, what does it mean to be a bystander when we see this? If we're part of a project, if we're part of an artistic team, or we're part of a foundation that's, granting money, what's our responsibility in also saying, actually, this doesn't feel right to me, and this is why we need to have a conversation about this. And I think that oftentimes that goes missing in this conversation around appropriation. Whoa, you've seen all my good things. All right, too fast. Okay, so cultural appropriation, some bullet points. It is the legal, unfair, or unjust taking of something that doesn't belong to you. I think this part around legality is really important because it's not just my feelings were hurt because you took my culture. Sometimes these have legal consequences, and we'll talk about that in a minute. It's the adoption of certain elements from another culture without the consent of people who belong to that culture. I think with movements like the Me Too movement, for example, this conversation around consent is, I think, more mainstream than it has ever been before, which is fantastic. We have more language. Also with the pandemic, depending on how you feel, if you have folks that are immune compromised or yourself, having to have language around consent, what feels comfortable for you, setting boundaries has also been more at the forefront. And so I would say even a decade ago, when I would talk about cultural appropriation with folks, we didn't have the same kind of language when we talked about consent. And so I think that's something that's positive now when we're thinking about cultural appropriation. We also want to consider it typically involves members from a dominant group. Again, we talked about what is culture. We want to remember it's our positionality in relationship to power. And so for appropriation, it's exploiting cultures of less privileged groups. And we can see this in so many different examples. And I'll just share two tonight. And often rooted in power dynamics that reinforce individual, structural, and systemic oppression that advantages benefit some and disadvantages others. So just some kind of overview basics. When we're talking about legality, I think it's always important to talk about the Indian Arts and Crafts Act. And I won't read all of this. It's from the Department of Interior. If you want to learn more, you can just, it's a simple Google search. It's very extensive. The entire act is outlined. But I think what's important to mention here that it prohibits misrepresentation. One of the things that people were mentioning here is stealing of the identity. Someone mentioned earlier in the chat, profiting. And so this Indian Arts and Crafts Act is really instrumental in trying to stop the misrepresentation and also the profiting. And I think these fines are always fascinating to me. So almost $250,000 here. Or a 5-year prison term. And I was doing some research before this talk, and these things are very ever rarely fully investigated and upheld. And so I'm just curious, and maybe we can talk in our discussion about, what is our responsibility as a community in terms of affirming that these things don't happen, since even though we have an act, it doesn't always have legal recourse. Certain states like New Mexico, for example, this is enacted a lot more, but what about areas where perhaps the population of Indigenous people isn't as prominent? So I want to share two stories with you. I picked this one because we are fast approaching Dia de los Muertos, and it's really important. Yeah,
Sorry, I really love that holiday.
Yeah, great. It's an important tradition for my family. We practice it as an artist, and so I just want to share this first story with you here. Again, I would say within the past decade, for a variety of reasons, we see the popularity of this holiday in the United States, but really up until the Chicano movement of the 1960s, this holiday was not practiced as much in the US. It was really with the Chicano movement, a cultural nationalist project that was trying to reclaim indigeneity, sometimes problematically, that romanticized an indigenous past. But that movement brought this to Chicano mainstream culture, whereas before it was really held in the pueblos in Mexico or in the ranchos for more folks that were connected to their indigeneity. So we know that this tradition dates back 3,000 years. And it is a tradition that has stayed alive despite Spanish invasion, despite colonization. Some people talk about it as an emerging with Catholicism, with the Spanish Catholic Church, but this was a practice that was done long before. Some things have changed, and I think that's an important thing to recognize about culture, is always changing. So for example, in our Indigenous practice, this would be practiced for 20 days or 40 days, depending on what kind of Indigenous community you were part of. And now it typically is 2 days, although there are a lot of Indigenous communities that practice longer. They practice at different times of the year, not this time, which is tied to the Spanish Catholic Church around All Souls Day, All Saints Day. Also, it's a celebration that's not just in Mexico, that other parts of Latin America, parts of the Caribbean, they have other forms of ways of celebrating this. And we know it's a tribute to those who have passed, to our ancestors. Here in the back image, you can see lots of fruits, pulque, tequila, pan de muerto, arroz, foods that people like to eat, drinks that people like to have. We have the calaveras, we have the cempasúchil, the marigolds, which help ancestors return home for the time. And so it's a really beautiful celebration that has survived thousands of years. It has survived colonial violence, and it continues to adapt today. I want to show a few images by Minnesota artists. This is Maria Cristina Tavera, who's part of my book. This is an ofrenda that she made for someone that passed. You can see some of the traditional elements, but in an artistic way. So we have pan de muerto, we have the cempasúchil still, we have the calaveras, we have copal, which is tree sap, oftentimes like 500 years old, that we burn in ceremony. I just think this is so beautiful. You have the light coming through, almost like stained glass here. This is an ofrenda that I made for my grandfather as part of the performance for the naked stages that I did. And this ofrenda is a community ofrenda, which happens a lot of times when we build. You can see these tiles down here were done with youth from Pillsbury House. And so we talked about what does it mean to die, and how in the culture which I'm coming from, while death can be sad, it's not scary because we have to have duality, life and death together. We have some traditional elements like the cempasúchil, the candles, but then we also have like traditional paperwork. So it's harder to see in this detail. This took many hours and many friends convincing to help me, but all of them are small little pieces of paper that are rolled and then placed to create these images. My grandfather was Roberto, but when he was little, they called him Bobby. So that's the Bobby. Another ofrenda that I did, this was for Festival de las Calaveras. This was outside Modus Locus in South Minneapolis. This piece is called Tenemos una Familia. We have a family. And in the back, the wallpaper, so to speak, I screen printed images of 4 trans Latinas who were murdered. And some of them were murdered while in the United States, some of them were murdered while they were crossing, and some just died when we're not sure exactly how in ICE custody and when they were in deportation custody. Again, this image, while it's an ofrenda and we have some traditional elements, is also remixed. And so thinking about how culture can adapt and shift. Again, we have the cempasúchil, we have the Virgen de Guadalupe, we have the tequila on the left, and I'll show you some details here. Again, these in Minnesota, it's hard to get cempasúchil, the marigolds, especially, everybody's going to go to Mercado Central or somewhere to get them or try to grow their own. So the paper flowers are really useful for us.
I love the ofrenda. I love how it is remixed. It has a different style to it. It still feels so respectful of of our culture.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So yeah, here's some more details of that. The books are by queer and trans writers of color. And just thinking about in this ofrenda, one of the things I was thinking about was the domestic space. A Chicana feminist artist, Amelia Mesa Baines, does a lot of these type of domestic space ofrendas. How our everyday, what happens to the everyday when we are no longer living? And I was thinking about the trans Latinas who were murdered. What did their bedrooms look like? Did they have notes on the mirror to themselves? Did they, leave their jewelry and makeup out? Were they really orderly? What would our rooms look like if we didn't know we weren't returning to them? And I think oftentimes when we're talking particularly about this community, we forget the little details of our humanity, looking in the mirror and putting your lipstick on. And so I wanted to uplift those. So at the same time that we have this ancestral celebration, this remixing by artists. We also have appropriation, as we know. I know you've all seen these images. They're not new by any means. The one on the right with the woman always kills me because it's like a sexy Katrina, which is the way we culturally believe it's very dangerous. Not only is it just not a costume, but we practice this and believe that our ancestors are returning, and there are certain energies that elders tell us that you don't just mess with, you don't play with. And perhaps in your own cultures you have similar stories, but it's not a game, it's not a toy. And so when I see this, at first I used to be really upset and angry, like how dare they? And now I'm just afraid for these people that do these kind of things. But I'm like, you're messing with something that's beyond you. And we don't know what the effects of that will be. And absolutely, yeah, super hypersexualized, of course, which is just like another over the top. They make everything sexy something for Halloween, right? But one story that I wanted to share about cultural appropriation, and perhaps you've heard this. This was a while ago now, in 2013. Disneyland, before Coco came out. I know people love the movie Coco. I think it's beautiful. I saw it with my mom when it first came out. But before that, they were preparing for Coco, and what they wanted to do was trademark the Dia de los Muertos and Day of the Dead. They wanted to trademark that phrase. That would be like trademarking Christmas, right? It's like, it's so part of our culture. And so there, of course, was a huge backlash. And this is one of my favorites here. It says, it's coming to trademark your culture, Muerto Mouse. This has been done by Lalo Alcaraz. He's a Chicano in California. Just making fun of this idea that how do you trademark a name like this, right? It's just really over the top. Another story I want to share is one about elote. And this story is about a particular business. And I just want to put a caveat that I'm not picking on this particular business because it happens all the time. This just happens to be the one that happened most recently last year. And so it's fresh in my memory, but we see this happen over and over again. We see this happen across the country. I picked one in St. Paul because it was close to home. But for us, elote, corn, is really sacred. I know a lot of us know about this three sisters, bean, squash, and corn. They're integral to the Americas. Corn was an indigenous crop that we had. In Mexico Tenochtitlan, which perhaps you might hear of as Aztec Empire, but in that region, Mexico Tenochtitlan, there are many different indigenous groups, one being Aztec, but that they were able to develop very advanced scientific agricultural systems to cultivate and harvest corn. They were able to put corn through nixtamal, which made it more nutritious and more digestible. So when Spanish invaders came, they tried to eat the corn and they just ate it as is, and they couldn't digest it. It was too hard on their stomachs because indigenous people had developed these advanced culinary ways to use it. For corn across the Americas, whether we're talking about the Lakota or we're talking about the Mexica, indigenous communities all across the Americas have different creation stories about corn, different ancestral memories in relationship to corn. And specifically thinking about the Mexica people, corn is part of, or the Maya culture, for example, corn is part of how we came to be as human. And so it's deeply, deeply sacred. It's not, just a really good food that you can get at the state fair for us. It has a much deeper meaning here. One of the artists that I look at, her name is Deborah Ramos, and she has this project, Proyectos en Tial, where she works with indigenous people of the North and indigenous people of the South to grow corn in these community gardens. Unfortunately, the garden is no longer there. It was turned into housing. So these are images from years ago, but I wanted to show you an example of how you can take a sacred element like the corn and turn it into something really beautiful. And then I'll share a story of how it was not done as such. So here you can see families working together. You see Mujeres with the rebozo here. This is a really important cultural artifact that we have. We use the rebozo to keep warm, to protect ourselves when we're doing labor. We use the rebozo in labor, physical pregnancy labor. I just had a daughter 2 years ago, almost to this date, and we use the rebozo to help bring the baby. And then we use the rebozo to carry the baby. So here you can see in these images, we have a lot of specific cultural artifacts. This is what the community gardens looks like. I just love this sign of Andres and Maria. It's their garden, their couple garden. So Deborah grew in Sub Anthony the corn. She would then take the corn and she would make pulp out of it. And here she's teaching some young folks how to do it. You can see how it develops over time once it's flattened and it dries out. One of my favorite projects, though, that she did was she made these corn paper sculptures on the left. This one's called Emerging Earth. You can kind of tell these are women's bodies. I have other images where she put the corn paper over a pregnant woman, so you could really see the body in that way. But I just think they're so remarkable when we think about the ancestral history of corn, when we think about feminist ecology, for example. There's many ways we can read this, but I just think this piece is so beautiful. And then on the right-hand side, Wichoni Zentli, live corn, Wichoni coming from the Lakota word here, mini Wichoni, in our popular imagination now, we have a young fetus growing up here through the corn. We have a corn woman. And again, all of this talking about the indigenous communities of the North and South coming together, and how for them Wichoni life, water being life, for the indigenous people of the South, corn being life, and how we can bring these together. So what happens when something is sacred for us, like elote, is taken in a way outside of our culture and community? Here in St. Paul, there was a restaurant called Elote, and it was Elote's wood fire cantina. It was owned by a white man. I'm not sure who the other investors were, but there was no tie to the community. And prior to the restaurant being opened, many folks from the Latinx community went, had conversations, said, could you please change the name? That's all they were asking. They weren't saying, don't open your business. They weren't saying, don't sell corn. They weren't saying, don't sell tacos. They were saying simply, like, this is very sacred, and this is a form of cultural appropriation that does not feel good to us. Can you please change the name? And he refused, and he refused, and he refused. So they put together a campaign, No Mas Cultural Appropriation, and it was led by young people, by cultural leaders. Here you have the back of Sergio, who was one of the founders of Indigenous Roots. There were other business owners that were part of it, Latino business owners that owned food. For example, Dulceria, who used to own Dulceria Bakery, was part of this. A lot of people coming together saying, please, can you just change the name? And that didn't happen, so they started a formal campaign. In this campaign, they did a social media campaign as well as a protest, and they said the issue is not that they're cooking their interpretation of Mexican food. The use of the ancestral and sacred word elotes is the name of the restaurant is problematic and unacceptable. No mas cultural appropriation. They talked about culinary appropriation, and they said, food's universal. It's an important way that we connect with people. Cooking ethnic food, eating it, that's not the problem. If you're a person of the dominant culture, in particular, monetizing off of another culture's food, at the minimum, you should do these things. And that's what they felt like were not being done. Doing the research, connecting with the community, being transparent. And again, I think the big key that we're talking about here is that we are not talking specifically about saying, like, never make this corn, but how are you benefiting? How are you profiting from this work? And yes, Unicorn Riot covered it. We also covered it. We covered it first on Latina Theory on our podcast. And then we did the media campaign that I'm showing you now, and that didn't work. And so then Sergio and others went out to do a in-person protest. And that's when Unicorn Riot was there to cover, which was great. So this is from the protest that Unicorn Riot covered. Sergio says, Elote is sacred. It is a representation of our ancestral roots. It's been passed down from generation to generation and used in ritual ceremonies even today. And here you see two other youth workers that are having a conversation and talking about their feelings regarding elote. When we think about these stories, we think about Los Muertos, we think about elote in the term, kind of breaking down the difference between appropriation and appreciation. And we've talked extensively about appropriation in terms of profit, exotify or fetishizing other cultures, reduction in characterization. Folks in the comments mentioned stereotypes, and are the erasure of cultural origin. And I think what oftentimes doesn't always get addressed, but I think is important, is appropriation. Usually we have language around, oh, I'm borrowing, or I'm honoring, inspiring, I'm being respectful, but that doesn't mean that you have relationship with people. Those are just words that oftentimes make the person that's appropriating feel better. So what do we want? We want cultural appreciation, and that's where you're not profiting off of a particular cultural marginalized community. You don't reduce to these stereotypical racist, sexist ways, of course, Halloween being the great example. It's an investment. And I think investment here, we're talking about investment in multiple ways. We're talking about it in terms of building deep relationship. We're also talking about it in forms of capital, social capital, financial capital. And then lastly, honors the cultural practices and spaces of historically marginalized communities by consent. Again, there's that word consent again, reflection and listening. And that's very different, right? On the opposite side, when you're saying, I'm borrowing, I'm honoring, but are you really listening to what the community was saying? For example, with the elotes, it wasn't about shut down the business. It was just change your name. You know, he eventually did change the name just to Woodfire Cantina, but there'll be another person that does it next year, right? It's continuous. So how do we have a larger societal shift to really understand the distinction between this appropriation and appreciation? So I have rattled off a lot. I will leave it there. Have some questions. I'd love to just have a broader discussion. All right. Well, thanks everyone. Take care.
Thank you.